Don't expect money. We didn't want you then, and we don't want you now. At 67, Dorothy Williams heard these crushing words from the billionaire mother who abandoned her as a baby. But what happened next would expose a family empire's darkest secrets and change everything forever. Welcome to our channel. I'm bringing you an incredible true story of family betrayal and ultimate justice that will keep you on the edge of your seat. Make sure to watch until the very end because the final twist will absolutely blow your mind. And please comment below what city you're watching from. I love seeing how far these stories travel around the world. The rain hammered against my windshield as I sat in my beat-up Honda Civic, staring up at the iron gates of the Ashworth estate, 67 years old, and my hands were still shaking like a teenager on her first date. But this wasn't romance. This was reckoning. "You don't have to do this, Mom." Sarah's voice crackled through my phone's speaker. Even from 3,000 miles away in her Hollywood Hills mansion, my daughter could sense my terror. "We can turn around right now." I gripped the steering wheel tighter, my arthritis flaring in the cold October air. "I've waited 50 years for this moment, honey. I'm not backing down now." The truth was, I'd been dreaming of this day since I was 17 years old, standing in the maternity ward of St. Mary's Hospital in Cleveland, holding the only clue to my identity, a birth certificate with 2 blank lines where my parents' names should have been. The nurses had whispered among themselves, thinking I couldn't hear. Poor thing. Dropped off like yesterday's newspaper. Some people have no shame. But shame was exactly what had brought me here to Napa Valley, California, to the sprawling vineyard estate that stretched as far as the eye could see. After decades of dead ends, false leads, and doors slammed in my face, a DNA test had finally cracked the code that defined my entire existence. Victoria and Charles Ashworth, billionaire real estate moguls, philanthropists, and my biological parents. The security guard emerged from his booth, his uniform crisp despite the downpour. I rolled down my window, feeling the cold rain splash against my cheek. "Ma'am, do you have an appointment?" His voice carried that practiced politeness that barely masked suspicion. I handed him the letter I'd crafted and rewritten dozens of times. "Dorothy Williams to see Victoria Ashworth. It's personal." He retreated to his booth, speaking into his radio in hushed tones. Minutes ticked by like hours. I thought about turning around, driving back to my studio apartment in Sacramento, pretending this moment had never come. But then I remembered Sarah's words from last night. "Mom, you've spent your whole life wondering. Don't you think it's time you knew?" The gates groaned open with mechanical precision. The driveway wound through manicured gardens that probably cost more to maintain than I'd earned in my entire lifetime. Marble fountains spurted water into perfectly geometric pools. Ancient oak trees stood sentinel, their branches heavy with Spanish moss that whispered secrets in the wind. This wasn't just wealth. This was generational power, the kind that shaped cities and bought politicians. And somewhere in this palace, the people who'd created me were waiting. I parked my Honda next to a row of luxury vehicles, a Bentley II Mercedes and something Italian I couldn't even pronounce. My car looked like a rust bucket in comparison, which was exactly what it was. But I'd earned every dent and scratch working double shifts at the diner, saving every penny to put Sarah through college when her deadbeat father disappeared. The mansion loomed before me, all glass and stone in impossible angles that seemed to defy gravity itself. I'd seen pictures in architectural magazines during my research, but standing here in person, I felt like an ant approaching a skyscraper. The front door opened before I could even knock. "Miss Williams." The woman who greeted me wasn't Victoria Ashworth, but clearly someone in her employ. Mid-40s, severe black suit, the kind of professional polish that screamed expensive education. "Mrs. Ashworth will see you in the morning room. Please follow me." My footsteps echoed on marble floors that probably cost more than most people's houses. Original paintings lined the walls, not prints, but real masterpieces that belonged in museums. I recognized a Monet, a Van Gogh pieces worth millions casually displayed like family photos. She's been expecting you, the woman continued, her heels clicking with military precision. Expecting me. The word sent a chill down my spine. How long had they known? We passed through a living room that could have hosted a small wedding complete with a fireplace large enough to roast a whole pig. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered panoramic views of the valley below where workers tended to grapevines that would become wines costing more per bottle than I spent on groceries in a month. Through here, the woman said, gesturing to a set of French doors. The morning room was smaller but no less intimidating with cream-colored walls and furniture that looked like it had never been actually sat upon. And there, silhouetted against the gray sky beyond the window, stood Victoria Ashworth. She was smaller than I'd imagined. In photographs, she commanded attention with her sharp features and steel gray hair pulled back in a severe bun. But in person at 73, she seemed almost fragile. Almost. Then she turned around. Her eyes were blue, the exact shade of blue I saw in my own mirror every morning, the same eyes Sarah had inherited, the same eyes that had always made strangers comment on our family resemblance, despite the fact that I'd adopted her as a baby myself. So, Victoria Ashworth said, her voice carrying the crisp authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. You're the one who's been causing all this trouble. I opened my mouth to speak, but she raised one perfectly manicured hand to silence me. Before you say anything, let me make something perfectly clear. I don't know what you think you're going to accomplish by coming here, but if you're expecting some tearful reunion, or God forbid money, you're in for a very rude awakening. The words hit me like physical blows. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. In my dreams, and yes, I dreamed about this moment countless times, there had been tears, explanations, maybe even understanding. I'd imagined her saying she'd thought about me every day, that giving me up had been the hardest decision of her life. Instead, I was getting a boardroom dismissal. I'm not here for money, I managed to whisper. Victoria laughed, but there was no humor in it. Of course you're not. They never are at first, but somehow it always comes down to money, doesn't it? How much do you want? 50,000, 100, name your price and sign a non-disclosure agreement, and we can put this unfortunate situation behind us. Unfortunate situation. The words came out louder than I'd intended. Is that what you call your daughter? You are not my daughter. Each word was enunciated with surgical precision. You were a mistake. A momentary lapse in judgment that Charles and I corrected 67 years ago. The fact that you share some genetic material with us doesn't make you family. I felt something crack inside my chest. Not break. I'd been broken before, but crack like ice under pressure, creating fissures that might never heal. Do you have any idea what my life has been like? I asked, my voice growing stronger despite the tremor in my hands. Do you care at all? Victoria moved to a small bar cart in the corner, pouring herself 2 fingers of what looked like very expensive whiskey. She didn't offer me any. I assume it's been adequately middle class, she said without looking at me. You're clean, reasonably well-dressed for someone of your station. You've clearly had access to education and health care. What more could you have wanted to... Parents, I said simply. A family. People who loved me. Love, Victoria practically spat the word. Such a quaint concept. Do you know what love gets you in the real world? Weakness, vulnerability, bad decisions. She turned back to face me, taking a slow sip of her drink. We gave you the greatest gift we could, freedom from the burden of our expectations. I thought about the Hendersons, the couple who'd adopted me when I was 3 years old. Jim Henderson, who worked construction and came home every night smelling of sawdust and sweat, who'd never missed one of my school plays despite being dead tired. Martha Henderson, who stayed up all night when I had the flu, who taught me to bake cookies and told me bedtime stories about princesses who saved themselves. They'd loved me fiercely, completely, without reservation. But they'd also been poor, struggling to make ends meet, unable to give me the advantages that money could buy. When Jim died of a heart attack when I was 16, Martha had to work 3 jobs just to keep our little house. She died 10 years later, worn out from a lifetime of hard work and sacrifice. The Hendersons loved me, I said quietly. They were better parents in 3 years than you could have been in a lifetime. Victoria's expression didn't change, but I saw something flicker in those familiar blue eyes. Annoyance, maybe, or perhaps just boredom. I'm sure they were lovely people, she said dismissively. But let's not pretend that sentiment changes the reality of your situation. You're here because you want something from us. Everyone always wants something. I wanted to know where I came from, I said. I wanted to understand why I was given away. I wanted to know if you ever thought about me, if you ever wondered how I was doing, if you ever regretted— Regretted what? Victoria interrupted. Making a responsible decision. Charles and I were young, unmarried, completely unprepared for parenthood. We were building an empire, not playing house. Keeping you would have been selfish and irresponsible. So you just threw me away. We placed you with people who could provide appropriate care. Her tone was that of someone explaining a simple business transaction. It was the logical choice. I stared at her, this woman who'd carried me in her womb for 9 months, who'd given birth to me, who'd held me for however briefly before signing papers to erase me from her life. There was no warmth in her face, no recognition of our connection, no acknowledgement that I was anything more than an inconvenience to be managed. "Where's Charles?" I asked suddenly. Where's your husband?" Something shifted in Victoria's expression just for a moment. "Charles passed away 2 years ago." The words hit me unexpectedly hard. I'd never met the man, would never meet him now, but somehow learning of his death felt like losing something I'd never known I had. "I'm sorry," I said automatically. Victoria's laugh was bitter. "Are you sorry for a man you never knew? How wonderfully sentimental." "I'm sorry because he was my father," I said firmly. "Biology doesn't change because you refuse to acknowledge it." "Charles was never your father in any way that mattered." Victoria finished her whiskey and set the glass down with more force than necessary. "A father is someone who raises a child, who provides for them, who shapes their character. Charles was simply a biological contributor to your existence, nothing more." The coldness in her voice was almost impressive in its completeness. I'd known this might not go well, but I'd never imagined such total rejection. Even in my worst-case scenarios, I'd assumed there would be some acknowledgement of our connection, some recognition that I was a human being worthy of basic courtesy. "Did you ever wonder about me?" I asked quietly. "In 67 years, did you ever once think about what happened to the baby you gave away?" Victoria moved to the window, looking out at her perfect gardens, her manicured paradise. For a long moment she was silent, and I allowed myself to hope that maybe finally I'd touch something human in her. "No," she said simply. "I never wondered about you. That would have served no purpose." The words were delivered with such casual cruelty that I actually gasped. It was one thing to be rejected. It was another to be told that your entire existence had been so thoroughly dismissed that it hadn't even warranted a passing thought. "How can you be so cold?" I whispered. Victoria turned back to me, and for the first time I saw something that might have been real emotion in her eyes. Anger. "Cold," she repeated. "You think I'm cold." "Let me tell you something about cold, Ms. Williams. Cold is what happens when you learn that sentiment is a luxury the powerful can't afford. Cold is what protects you when everyone around you wants something from you. Cold is what keeps you alive in a world that would devour you the moment you show weakness." She moved closer, and I could see the lines around her eyes, the careful makeup that couldn't quite hide her age, the way her hands trembled almost imperceptibly with what might have been rage or simply too much caffeine. You have no idea what my life has been like, she continued. You see the money, the house, the cars, and you think it's all been handed to me on a silver platter. But every dollar we earned, every property we acquired, every deal we closed required sacrifice. It required making hard choices that people like you could never understand. People like me, I stood up, my own anger finally breaking through the hurt. You don't know anything about people like me. You don't know what it's like to work 3 jobs just to pay rent. You don't know what it's like to choose between buying groceries and buying medicine. You don't know what it's like to lie awake at night wondering if you're going to lose your home because you can't make the mortgage payment. Victoria's smile was sharp as a blade. No, I don't, because I made choices that ensured I would never have to face those problems, including the choice to give you to people who were equipped to handle them. The Hendersons struggled every day of their lives, I said, my voice rising. But they loved me. They sacrificed for me. They would have died for me. Can you say the same? Love doesn't pay bills, Victoria replied coolly. Love doesn't build empires. Love doesn't create legacies that last for generations. What kind of legacy are you talking about? I gestured around the opulent room. All this stuff, these things, what happens to your precious legacy when you're dead? Who's going to inherit your empire? Who's going to carry on the Ashworth name? For the first time since I'd arrived, Victoria hesitated. It was just for a moment, but I caught it. A flicker of something that might have been uncertainty. We have James, she said finally, my brother's son. He's been groomed to take over the business since he was a child. Your nephew, I said. Not your son, not your blood. Blood? Victoria scoffed. You seem to think blood means something, that sharing DNA creates some mystical connection that transcends everything else. Let me disabuse you of that romantic notion right now. Blood means nothing without commitment. It means nothing without choice. James has chosen to be part of this family. He's earned his place through dedication and hard work. You're nothing more than a biological accident. The words were meant to wound, and they succeeded. But they also revealed something Victoria probably hadn't intended, a vulnerability. She was trying too hard to convince me that family meant nothing, which suggested that maybe somewhere deep down she knew it meant everything. If blood means nothing, I said slowly, then why are you so determined to reject me? If I'm just a stranger with some shared DNA, why not treat me like any other visitor? Why the hostility? Why the cruelty? Victoria's eyes narrowed. Because strangers don't show up at my door making implicit demands. Strangers don't threaten the stability of everything I've built. Strangers don't bring complications that could unravel decades of careful planning. What complications? I asked. I told you I don't want your money. I just wanted to meet you to understand. You think this is just about money. Victoria laughed harshly. You have no idea how naive you are. This is about reputation. This is about public perception. This is about maintaining the image that the Ashworth family has cultivated for over half a century. I stared at her pieces clicking into place. You're afraid someone will find out about me. I'm not afraid of anything, Victoria said quickly, too quickly. You are, I pressed. You're terrified that people will discover the perfect philanthropic power couple abandoned their own child. How would that look in the society pages? How would your charity friends react when they found out you donated millions to orphanages while throwing away your own daughter? Victoria's face had gone pale, but her voice remained steady. You're being dramatic. Am I? Let me guess. You and Charles built your reputation partly on your charitable giving, probably focused on children's causes, right? Maybe foster care organizations, adoption agencies. How generous of you to help other unwanted children while pretending yours never existed. On the silence stretched between us like a taut wire ready to snap. Victoria's hands were no longer just trembling, they were shaking with barely contained rage. Get out, she said quietly. Did I hit a nerve? I asked. How many awards have you won for your humanitarian work? How many galas have you attended? How many speeches have you given about the importance of caring for society's most vulnerable children, all while knowing that you'd thrown away your own child like garbage? Get out. Victoria's composed mask finally cracked completely. You have no right to come into my home and make accusations. You have no right to judge decisions you couldn't possibly understand. I have every right, I shouted back, 67 years of pain and abandonment pouring out in a torrent. I'm your daughter. I'm the child you created and discarded. I'm the living consequence of your responsible decision, and I have every right to know why you could save every other unwanted child in California except me. Victoria's face was flushed, her perfect composure completely shattered. You want to know why you really want to know, because keeping you would have ruined everything. Charles and I were nobodies back then, two kids from middle-class families with big dreams and no connections. An illegitimate child would have destroyed our reputation before we'd even built it. It would have closed doors, ended opportunities, made us social pariahs. We chose success over sentiment, and I don't regret that choice for 1 second. The truth hung in the air between us like a toxic cloud. She'd chosen money and status over her own child. She'd built her empire on the foundation of my abandonment, and she wasn't sorry. You're not sorry, I said quietly, my anger suddenly draining away into something much worse, a deep, bone-deep sadness that felt like drowning. No, Victoria said, her voice returning to its earlier ice. I'm not sorry. I'm successful. I'm powerful. I'm respected. I've built something that will outlast me by generations. What have you built? What legacy are you leaving? A daughter who isn't even your biological child, and a lifetime of mediocrity. The mention of Sarah made my hands clench into fists. Don't you dare talk about my daughter. Your adopted daughter, so, Victoria corrected with vicious precision. The child someone else didn't want, just like you were someone we didn't want. It's almost poetic, isn't it? The unwanted raising the unwanted. Something inside me snapped. Not broke. Shattered. Into a million pieces that would never fit back together the same way. Sarah's worth 100 of you, I said, my voice deadly quiet. She's talented, successful, kind, generous. Everything you pretend to be in public but couldn't be in private if your life depended on it. Victoria's smile was poison. I'm sure she's lovely, but success built on talent is temporary. Success built on business acumen lasts forever. Your daughter will fade. My legacy will endure. Your legacy, I repeated. Let me tell you about your legacy. Your legacy is a 67-year-old woman who spent her entire life wondering why she wasn't good enough to keep. Your legacy is a successful person who still feels broken inside because the people who were supposed to love her most couldn't be bothered to try. Your legacy is standing right in front of you and you're too blind to see it. For a moment, just a moment, I thought I saw something crack in Victoria's facade, a flicker of recognition, maybe even regret. But then the mask slammed back down with almost audible force. My legacy, she said coldly, is the Ashworth name. It's the buildings we've constructed, the businesses we've created, the jobs we've provided, the charities we've funded. It's not a bitter old woman who couldn't let go of childhood trauma. The cruelty was breathtaking in its precision. She'd found exactly where to push to cause maximum damage, and she'd done it with surgical skill. You're right, I said softly. I couldn't let go. For 67 years, I held on to the hope that someday I'd meet my biological parents and understand. I hoped that maybe there was a good reason you gave me up. I hoped that maybe you'd thought about me over the years, wondered how I was doing, maybe even missed me a little bit. Victoria said nothing. But you know what the worst part is, I continued. The worst part is that I'm still hoping. Even after everything you've said, even after you've made it crystal clear that I mean nothing to you, part of me is still hoping that you'll realize what you're throwing away, that you'll see that I'm not here to hurt you or take anything from you. I'm just here to be your daughter." The silence that followed was deafening. Victoria stood perfectly still, her face a mask of cold indifference, while I waited for something, anything that might indicate there was a human being beneath all that ice. But there was nothing. "Are we finished?" she asked finally, as if I were a particularly tedious business meeting that had run over schedule. I looked at her, really looked at her, and saw my own eyes staring back at me with complete emptiness. This woman had carried me for 9 months, had felt me kick and move inside her, had gone through labor to bring me into the world. And she felt nothing for me, less than nothing. "Yes," I said quietly, "I think we are." I turned toward the door, each step feeling like I was walking through quicksand. Behind me, I heard Victoria return to the bar cart, pouring herself another drink as if nothing had happened. "Ms. Williams," she called out just as I reached the French doors. I turned back, some foolish part of me still hoping. "The next time you feel like taking a trip down memory lane," Victoria said, raising her glass in a mock toast, "don't. You've gotten your answer. We didn't want you then, and we don't want you now. Don't make this more difficult than it needs to be." I nodded, no longer surprised by her capacity for cruelty. "Goodbye, Victoria." "Mrs. Ashworth, verste," she corrected automatically. "No," I said firmly. "You're just Victoria to me. A mother would have earned the right to be called Mrs. Ashworth." I walked out of that morning room with my head held high, but inside I was crumbling. The efficient woman in the black suit was waiting to escort me out, her face carefully neutral. I wondered how many scenes like this she'd witnessed, how many inconvenient people she'd helped usher out of the Ashworth family's perfect life. The marble floors seemed to stretch for miles as we walked back through the mansion. The paintings on the walls looked different now, not treasures, but trophies, evidence of wealth accumulated while their biological daughter scraped by paycheck to paycheck. The opulence that had intimidated me when I arrived now just made me sad. All this beauty, all this luxury built on a foundation of deliberate heartlessness. "Your car is just through here," the woman said, opening the massive front door. The rain had stopped, but the sky remained gray and threatening. My Honda looked even more pathetic next to the luxury vehicles, but suddenly I was proud of it. I'd bought that car with money I'd earned honestly. Every dent had a story. Every scratch represented a mile traveled towards something better. "Ma'am." The woman's voice stopped me as I reached for my car door handle. "For what it's worth, I'm sorry." I turned to look at her, surprised by the unexpected kindness. "I've worked for the family for 15 years," she continued quietly, glancing back toward the house. "I've seen a lot of people come and go, but I've never seen anyone with your courage." "Courage," I laughed bitterly. "I just got destroyed in there." "No," she said firmly. "You came here knowing it might go badly, and you stood your ground anyway. That's courage." She paused, seeming to wrestle with some internal decision. "Mrs. Ashworth wasn't always like this, you know. Mr. Charles, he was different, softer. I think he might have made different choices if he'd had the chance." The words were clearly meant as comfort, but they only made everything worse. If Charles had been the reasonable one, the one with a heart, then I'd lost my only chance to connect with a biological parent. Death had stolen that possibility before I'd even known it existed. "Thank you," I managed to say. What's your name?" "So, Eleanor," she replied. "Eleanor Martinez." "Thank you, Eleanor, for your kindness." She nodded and stepped back as I climbed into my car. The engine coughed to life with its familiar wheeze, and I slowly drove down the perfect driveway toward the iron gates. In my rearview mirror, I could see Eleanor still standing in the doorway, a small figure of humanity in the face of institutional coldness. As the gates closed behind me with mechanical finality, I pulled over to the side of the road and let the tears come. 67 years of wondering ended with such brutal completeness that I felt like I'd been hit by a truck. The fantasy I'd carried my entire life, of parents who'd loved me but couldn't keep me, who'd thought about me over the years, who might welcome me back with open arms, lay shattered on the marble floors of the Ashworth morning room. I sat there for 20 minutes crying for the little girl who'd grown up wondering why she wasn't worth keeping, for the teenager who'd stared at her reflection looking for clues about where she came from, for the woman who'd spent decades searching for answers that turned out to be more painful than the questions. Finally, I wiped my eyes and reached for my phone to call Sarah. But before I could dial, footsteps crunched on the gravel beside my car. I looked up to see a man approaching, tall, well-dressed, probably in his 40s. He looked familiar, though I was certain I'd never met him. "Dorothy Williams," he asked, his voice carrying the same crisp authority I'd heard from Victoria, but warmer somehow. I rolled down my window. "Yes." He smiled, and suddenly I knew where I'd seen him before, in the society pages of newspapers standing beside Victoria at various charity events. "I'm James Ashworth," he said, "Victoria's nephew. I was hoping we could talk." I stared at James Ashworth through my rain-streaked window, my heart still pounding from the emotional devastation I'd just endured. He looked nothing like Victoria, where she was sharp angles and cold precision. He had warm brown eyes and a gentle smile that seemed genuine, but I'd learned not to trust Ashworth family members in the span of a single afternoon. "I don't think we have anything to talk about," I said, my voice hoarse from crying. "Your aunt made her feelings quite clear." James glanced back toward the mansion, then leaned closer to my car. "Actually, that's exactly why we need to talk. May I—" He gestured toward my passenger seat. Every instinct told me to drive away, to put this nightmare behind me and never look back. But something in his expression stopped me, not pity, which I couldn't have handled, but what looked like genuine concern mixed with something else. Anger, maybe. "5 minutes," I said, unlocking the door. He slid into the passenger seat of my beat-up Honda with no apparent discomfort, which surprised me. Most people from his world wouldn't be caught dead in a car older than their wine collection. "First, let me apologize, Sub," he said immediately. "What Victoria did in there was unconscionable. I heard most of it from the hallway. You were listening, so I wasn't sure whether to be embarrassed or outraged. Eleanor called me when you arrived. She was concerned about how Victoria might react." He ran a hand through his hair, and I noticed his fingers were shaking slightly. "I got here as fast as I could, but apparently not fast enough to prevent a disaster." "So you knew about me?" James nodded grimly. "I've known about you for years. Charles told me before he died. He made me promise to find you someday to make things right. But Victoria—" He shook his head. "Victoria has been in complete denial about your existence. She's convinced herself that if she ignores you hard enough, you'll simply disappear." The revelation hit me like another punch to the gut. "Charles wanted to find me. He never stopped thinking about you, Dorothy. May I call you Dorothy?" When I nodded, he continued. "Charles kept a private investigator on retainer for decades just to make sure you were okay. He knew about your adoptive parents, your childhood, your struggles. He knew when you got married, when you divorced, when you adopted Sarah. He knew about every job you worked, every apartment you lived in." I felt like the world was tilting sideways. But he never contacted me. Victoria forbade it. She said it would only cause problems for everyone involved. She convinced him that you were better off without them, that reopening old wounds would be cruel. James's voice carried a bitterness that suggested old arguments. Charles was many things, but he wasn't strong enough to stand up to Victoria when she'd made up her mind about something. So he just watched from a distance. He did more than watch. Do you remember when Sarah was 12 and needed that emergency surgery for her appendix? I stared at him. "How do you know about that?" "The anonymous donor who paid your hospital bill when your insurance denied the claim, that was Charles. The scholarship fund that helped Sarah get into UCLA, Charles established it specifically for her. The grant that covered your trade school tuition when you decided to become a paralegal." James met my eyes. All Charles. The words hit me like a physical force. For years I'd wondered about those miraculous financial gifts that had appeared at exactly the right moments. I'd assumed it was some kind of bureaucratic error or clerical mix-up that I'd been too grateful to question too deeply. "He was taking care of us," I whispered. As much as Victoria would allow, she insisted on complete anonymity, no direct contact. Charles wanted to do more, but Victoria threatened to cut him off from his own business if he reached out to you directly. The company was their baby. She'd built it from nothing alongside him. She had the power to destroy everything he'd worked for. I thought about Victoria's cold dismissal, her casual cruelty, and felt a new wave of anger wash over me. She controlled him. "Victoria controls everyone," James said quietly. "It's how she's built her empire. Fear, manipulation, emotional blackmail, says whatever works. She's been grooming me to take over the business since I was 16, but every decision has to go through her. Every relationship, every friendship, every romantic involvement gets her approval or it gets eliminated." "Then why are you here talking to me? Won't she be furious?" James smiled, and for the first time it wasn't entirely pleasant. "That's the thing about being groomed to run an empire. Eventually you learn how the game is played, and Victoria made a crucial mistake today." "What kind of mistake?" Instead of answering directly, James pulled out his phone and showed me a document. "This is Charles's will. The real one, not the sanitized version Victoria had read at the funeral." I looked at the screen, but the legal language was dense and confusing. "I don't understand." "Charles left specific instructions regarding you and Sarah. There's a trust fund, a substantial one, that was supposed to be activated upon his death. Victoria has been sitting on it for 2 years, hoping you'd never surface." James scrolled to a highlighted section. "But there's more. According to the bloodline clause in the original Ashworth family trust, you have legal rights to board membership and voting shares in the company." The words swam before my eyes. "Board membership, voting shares, I don't understand what that means." "It means Victoria doesn't have absolute control anymore. It means her nephew isn't the only heir to the Ashworth legacy. It means you have the legal right to walk into any board meeting and demand answers about how the family business is being run." James's smile grew wider. "It means Victoria's worst nightmare just came true." I sat back in my seat trying to process what he was telling me. "How much money are we talking about?" "The trust fund Charles left for you and Sarah is worth approximately $600 million. The voting shares represent about 30% of company control. Combined with my shares, we could potentially outvote Victoria on major business decisions." $600 million. The number was so large it didn't feel real. "I made $23,000 last year working part-time at the law office. Sarah's entire Hollywood career hadn't earned a fraction of that amount." "This is insane," I said finally. "A few hours ago I was just a woman looking for answers about her birth parents. Now you're telling me I'm some kind of heiress." "You're more than an heiress," James said seriously. "You're Victoria's kryptonite. Everything she's built, every careful plan she's made for the future of this company depends on maintaining complete control. Your existence threatens all of that." "But why would Charles do this if he never contacted me directly? Why would he leave me so much?" James was quiet for a moment, looking out at the perfectly manicured grounds of the estate. Charles was a complicated man. He loved Victoria, but he also knew what she was capable of. I think leaving you that trust fund was his way of ensuring that someday somebody would be able to stand up to her, someone with the resources to fight back." "Fight back against what?" "Victoria hasn't built the Ashworth empire by playing nice Dorothy. She's destroyed careers, bankrupted competitors, and silenced anyone who threatened her interests. The charitable giving, the philanthropic work, it's all image management, a way to buy respectability and deflect attention from some very questionable business practices." I thought about Victoria's passionate defense of her success, her insistence that she'd made hard choices others couldn't understand. "What kind of questionable practices?" James glanced around nervously, as if Victoria might be listening from the bushes. "Not here. Too risky. But if you're serious about learning the truth about your biological parents, there are things you need to know. things Charles documented before he died, insurance policies in case Victoria ever went too far. What are you suggesting? I'm suggesting that you don't just walk away from this. I'm suggesting that you take some time to think about what Charles wanted for you, what he intended when he structured his will the way he did. I'm suggesting that maybe Victoria needs to learn that actions have consequences. The idea was both terrifying and exhilarating. Part of me just wanted to drive back to Sacramento, return to my quiet life, and pretend this day had never happened. But another part of me, a part that had been growing stronger since Victoria's cruel dismissal, wanted to make her pay for 67 years of deliberate heartlessness. I need to talk to Sarah, I said finally. Of course, but Dorothy, there's something else you should know. Victoria called an emergency board meeting for tomorrow morning. She's going to try to restructure the company bylaws to eliminate the bloodline clause before you can invoke it. If she succeeds, your rights disappear permanently. Can she do that? Not legally, no, but Victoria has ways of making things happen that don't always follow traditional legal channels. She has judges in her pocket, lawyers on speed dial, and enough money to make problems disappear. If you're going to act on Charles's wishes, you need to do it soon. My head was spinning. 24 hours ago, my biggest concern had been whether I could afford to fix the transmission on my Honda. Now I was supposedly worth hundreds of millions of dollars and embroiled in some kind of corporate succession battle. This is all happening too fast, I said. I can't make decisions like this without thinking it through, without talking to Sarah. James nodded understandingly. I get it. But while you're thinking Victoria is planning, she didn't survive 60 years in business by waiting for her opponents to make up their minds. I'm not her opponent. I just wanted to meet my birth parents. You became her opponent the moment you rang her doorbell. Victoria doesn't see people, Dorothy. She sees threats and assets. Right now, you're the biggest threat she's ever faced. As if summoned by our conversation, my phone rang. Sarah's name appeared on the screen and I answered immediately. Mom, how did it go? You sound terrible. It was... I looked at James, who was listening intently. It was complicated, honey. More complicated than I expected. Bad complicated or good complicated? Both, I think. Sarah, I need you to come here, to California. I'm already packed. My flight lands at SFO at 11 tonight. I figured you might need moral support regardless of how it went. Relief flooded through me. You're amazing. I'm worried about you. The way your voice sounds. Mom, what happened? I looked at James again, trying to decide how much to explain over the phone. Your grandmother is not a nice person, but there are some developments that we need to discuss in person. Can you drive up to Napa tonight? Of course, text me the address. Are you okay? Do you need me to bring anything bail money? A good lawyer. Despite everything, I found myself smiling. Just bring yourself. And maybe your laptop. We might need to do some research. After I hung up, James was looking at me with a strange expression. Your daughter sounds remarkable, he said. She is. Sarah's the best thing that ever happened to me. Charles knew that. He was incredibly proud of her success, even though he'd never met her. He kept scrapbooks of her movie reviews, interviews, award ceremonies. Victoria threw them away after he died, but I managed to save some. The thought of this man I'd never met following Sarah's career from afar, being proud of her accomplishments, almost broke my heart all over again. He really cared about us. More than you'll ever know. And Dorothy's Sarah isn't just coming to support you emotionally. According to Charles's will, she's also a beneficiary of the trust fund. Victoria's actions today affected her future, too. I stared at him. Sarah inherits money, too. $50 million plus educational trust funds for any children she might have someday. Charles wanted to ensure that his biological family was taken care of for generations. The magnitude of what James was telling me was starting to sink in. This wasn't just about my personal hurt feelings or Victoria's cruelty. This was about Sarah's future, about opportunities, and security I could never have provided for her on my own. "What exactly are you asking me to do?" I said quietly. James met my eyes with steady determination. "I'm asking you to claim what Charles wanted you to have. I'm asking you to stand up to Victoria before she destroys the last decent thing Charles ever did. I'm asking you to help me save a company that employs thousands of people from a woman who sees them all as expendable resources. And if I say no, if I just want to walk away from all of this, then Victoria wins. She gets away with abandoning her own child, denying Charles's dying wishes, and continuing to build her empire on a foundation of ruthless cruelty. She gets to keep pretending that her charitable work makes up for the people she's destroyed along the way." The words hung in the air between us like a challenge. I thought about the woman in the morning room, the casual way she'd dismissed my entire existence, the calculated cruelty in her voice when she'd told me I'd never been wanted. I thought about Charles following my life from a distance, sending anonymous help when I needed it most, planning for a future where his daughter might finally receive the family inheritance she deserved. "Where would we even start?" I asked. James's smile was pure satisfaction. "With a legal bombshell that's going to make Victoria's perfect world explode. I know a lawyer, someone Victoria can't buy or intimidate, someone who specializes in family trust law and has been waiting years for a chance to take on the Ashworth family machine." "Why would anyone want to take on Victoria? She sounds terrifying." "Because she destroyed his father's construction business 20 years ago. Because she cost him his family home and his inheritance when she decided his land would be perfect for a shopping center. Because he's been dreaming of payback ever since, and you just handed him the key to her kingdom." I thought about my conversation with Sarah about her immediate offer to drop everything and fly across the country to support me. I thought about the Hendersons who'd love me unconditionally despite having so little to give. I thought about all the times I'd wondered if there was something fundamentally wrong with me that had made my birth parents give me away. "What's the lawyer's name?" I asked. "David Chen. He runs a small practice in San Francisco, but don't let that fool you. He's brilliant, honest, and he's been studying Ashworth family legal vulnerabilities for 2 decades. If anyone can navigate the maze of trusts and bylaws that Charles left behind, it's him." I looked back at the mansion, where Victoria was probably enjoying another expensive whiskey, confident that she'd successfully eliminated another threat to her perfect world. She had no idea that her rejected daughter was sitting in a beat-up Honda planning her downfall. "Call him," I said firmly. "Set up a meeting for tomorrow morning. But James, I want to be clear about something. I'm not doing this for revenge. I'm doing it because Charles apparently wanted his granddaughter to have opportunities I could never give her. I'm doing it because maybe it's time Victoria learned that her actions have consequences." James pulled out his phone and started dialing. "David, it's James Ashworth. Remember that conversation we had about hypothetical scenarios involving bloodline inheritance claims? Well, it's not hypothetical anymore." As James explained the situation to his lawyer friend, I sat back and tried to process the seismic shift my life had just taken. This morning, I'd been Dorothy Williams' retired paralegal living on Social Security and the occasional temp job. Tonight, I was apparently Dorothy Williams' potential heiress to a business empire locked in a battle of wills with one of the most powerful women in California. "He can see us at 9 tomorrow morning, Yo," James said, ending the call. "His office is in Chinatown. David says to bring copies of any documents you might have, birth certificate, adoption papers, anything that establishes your identity. I have all of that in my hotel room back in Sacramento. We'll drive down tonight and get them, then come back up for the meeting. Sarah can meet us at David's office." "Yes." The plan was forming with frightening speed, but something still bothered me. "James, why are you helping me? What do you get out of this?" He was quiet for a moment, staring out at the vineyard where workers were still tending the vines despite the late hour. "Victoria has been controlling my life since I was 16 years old. Every girlfriend I've had, every friend I've made, every business decision I've wanted to pursue. It all has to meet with her approval. She's groomed me to be her puppet, not her successor. And you think having me around will change that? I think having you around will give me an ally for the first time in 25 years, someone with the legal standing to question her decisions, the financial resources to fight her if necessary, and most importantly, someone who isn't afraid of her. What makes you think I'm not afraid of her? She terrifies me, James smiled. Because you stood in that room and called her out on 67 years of hypocrisy. Because you didn't back down when she tried to intimidate you. Because you're still here talking to me instead of running back to Sacramento with your tail between your legs. He had a point. I was scared, but I was also angry. More angry than I'd been in my entire life. There's something else, James continued. Victoria is planning something big. Something that goes beyond just restructuring company bylaws. She's been meeting with investors from overseas, people with questionable reputations. She's talking about selling major portions of the business to fund some kind of expansion project. Is that legal? Technically, yes, but Charles's will specifically prohibits the sale of core assets without unanimous board approval. If you claim your board seat, you can stop her. What if she tries to buy me off, offers me some money to go away and stay quiet? James laughed harshly. Oh, she'll definitely try that. Probably sometime tonight, actually. Victoria's greatest weakness is that she thinks everyone has a price. She can't comprehend someone who would choose principle over profit. As if on cue, my phone buzzed with a text message. Unknown number, but the message was clear. Ms. Williams, this is Victoria Ashworth. I believe we may have gotten off on the wrong foot today. Perhaps we could meet again tomorrow to discuss a mutually beneficial arrangement. I'm prepared to be quite generous. I showed the text to James, who read it with a grim smile. Right on schedule, he said. She's probably offering you a few million to sign a non-disclosure agreement and disappear forever. How much do you think she'll offer, knowing Victoria? She'll start with 5 million and work her way up to maybe 20 if you seem hesitant. To her, that's pocket change compared to maintaining control of a multi-billion-dollar empire. $20 million. 6 months ago, I would have thought that was an impossible amount of money. Now, knowing about the $600 million trust fund Charles had left for me and Sarah, it seemed almost insulting. What should I tell her? James considered this. Tell her you'll meet with her tomorrow afternoon, after we've seen David Chen, after we've got the legal paperwork started, after you've had a chance to understand exactly what your rights are. Let her think she might be able to buy you off, but don't commit to anything. I typed back, I'll consider meeting with you tomorrow afternoon. I need some time to process everything that happened today. The response came back within seconds. Of course, shall we say 2 p.m. at my office? We have much to discuss. She's already planning her strategy, James observed. Victoria doesn't waste time when she perceives a threat. Good thing we're not wasting time either, James nodded approvingly. Charles would be proud of you, Dorothy. He always hoped that someday his daughter would be strong enough to stand up to Victoria. He just never imagined it would happen like this. What was he like, Charles, I mean? Really, James's expression softened. He was complicated, brilliant in business, but not always strong when it came to personal relationships. He genuinely loved Victoria, even though she was impossible to love. He was kind to employees, generous with charities, but he let Victoria make too many decisions that went against his better judgment, including giving me away. That was different. They were young, unmarried, from conservative families that would have disowned them for having a child out of wedlock. In 1958, their choices were limited, but Charles never stopped regretting it. He used to say that giving you up was the worst decision he'd ever made, but Victoria convinced him it was the only responsible choice. And now he's given you the power to make your own choices. The trust fund, the board seat, the voting rights, it's all his way of saying he's sorry and giving you the tools to build whatever future you want. The sun was setting over the Napa Valley, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink that reminded me of the sunsets I'd watched from my apartment in Sacramento. but everything else about my world had changed in the span of a single afternoon. James, there's something I need to know. If we do this, if we fight Victoria for control of the company, what happens to all the employees? What happens to the charitable organizations that depend on Ashworth funding? That's exactly why we need to do this, James said seriously. Victoria sees employees as expenses to be minimized and charities as tax write-offs. She's been planning massive layoffs and funding cuts to increase profit margins. Charles's vision was different. He believed businesses had a responsibility to their communities. So we'd be saving jobs, potentially thousands of them, plus preserving funding for organizations that provide housing for homeless families, scholarships for disadvantaged kids, medical research programs. Victoria's been systematically eliminating anything that doesn't provide immediate returns. The weight of responsibility was staggering. This wasn't just about my personal relationship with my birth parents anymore. This was about affecting the lives of thousands of people I'd never met, communities I'd never seen, futures that depended on decisions I might make. I'm not qualified to run a business empire, I said quietly. You're qualified to be Charles's daughter, James replied. You're qualified to ask the hard questions Victoria doesn't want asked. You're qualified to demand that the company honor the values Charles built it on. As the last light faded from the sky, James and I sat in my beat-up Honda outside the gates of the Ashworth estate, planning a battle that would determine the future of a multi-billion-dollar empire. It felt surreal and terrifying and absolutely necessary all at the same time. Are you ready for this? James asked as I started the engine. I thought about Sarah flying across the country to support me, about Charles watching over me from a distance for 67 years, about Victoria's cold dismissal and casual cruelty. I thought about all the times I'd felt powerless, all the times I'd wondered what my life might have been like if I'd been born into different circumstances. No, I said honestly, but I'm going to do it anyway. James followed me back to Sacramento in his Mercedes, and we spent the drive in tense silence, punctuated by occasional phone calls to coordinate our next moves. By the time we reached my modest apartment complex, it was nearly midnight, but neither of us was remotely tired. Adrenaline had taken over, sharpening every sense and making sleep impossible. This is where you live, James asked not unkindly as he looked around my neighborhood. It wasn't dangerous, but it wasn't Beverly Hills either, Bob. Just a tired collection of aging apartment buildings populated by retirees, single mothers, and people working two jobs to make ends meet. 23 years? I said, unlocking my front door. It's not much, but it's home. James stepped into my small living room, and I saw him take in the second-hand furniture, the faded carpet, the stack of bills on my kitchen counter that I'd been strategizing how to pay. But instead of the judgment I'd expected, his expression was thoughtful, almost respectful. Charles would have liked this place, he said quietly. He grew up poor, you know. Before Victoria transformed him into a business mogul, he was just a working-class kid from Oakland who knew the value of every dollar. I gathered the documents from my bedroom: birth certificate, adoption papers, high school diploma, marriage certificate, divorce papers, Sarah's adoption records, the paper trail of an ordinary life that was about to become anything but ordinary. Dorothy, James said when I returned with the folder, I need you to understand what we're walking into tomorrow. Victoria has been preparing for war since the moment you left her estate. She's probably already called her lawyers, her accountants, maybe even some judges she has relationships with. This won't be a polite legal discussion. It'll be a battle. Then maybe we should get some reinforcements, I said, scrolling through my phone contacts. I may not have Victoria's resources, but I know some people who understand how to fight when the odds are stacked against them. I called Maria Santos, my former supervisor at the law firm where I'd worked as a paralegal. Maria had built her practice representing people who couldn't afford high-powered attorneys, immigrants fighting deportation workers, dealing with wage theft tenants, battling slumlords. She taught me that the law could be a weapon for justice if you knew how to wield it properly. Dorothy, it's midnight, honey. Is everything okay? Maria, I need a favor. A big one. Can you meet me in San Francisco tomorrow morning? I'm about to get into a legal fight that's way over my head, and I need someone I trust watching my back. How big of a fight are we talking about? I looked at James, who was listening intently. The kind that involves billionaires' family trusts and enough money to change lives. Maria was quiet for a moment. I'll be there. Text me the address. After I hung up, James looked impressed. Good thinking. Victoria will try to intimidate you with an army of corporate lawyers. Having your own counsel there levels the playing field. Maria's tougher than she looks. She once stared down a room full of immigration agents to protect a client. I think she can handle Victoria Ashworth. We drove back toward San Francisco in convoy, my Honda wheezing along behind James's Mercedes as we climbed through the hills separating the Central Valley from the Bay Area. The city lights glittered like scattered diamonds as we descended toward Chinatown, where David Chen's office waited in a narrow building squeezed between a dim sum restaurant and a shop selling Chinese herbs. It was nearly 3 in the morning when we finally stopped, but James insisted we scout the area before heading to our hotels. Victoria's people will be watching, he explained as we walked the quiet streets. She'll want to know who you're talking to, what kind of legal representation you're bringing, how serious you are about pursuing this. How do you know so much about her tactics? James's smile was grim. 25 years of being groomed as her successor teaches you a lot about how she operates. Victoria doesn't just defeat her opponents. She destroys them completely so they can never threaten her again. She's about to use every weapon in her considerable arsenal against you, including what happened to David Chen's father. Especially that. Victoria's been systematically eliminating anyone who might have grudges against the family. David's father wasn't her only victim. She's destroyed dozens of people over the years. Small business owners, former employees who asked inconvenient questions, journalists who got too close to uncomfortable truths. She leaves a trail of broken lives behind her everywhere she goes. The weight of what I was taking on pressed down on me like a physical force. This wasn't just about claiming an inheritance or getting acknowledgement from my birth mother. This was about stepping into a decades-long war between people with the resources to destroy each other completely. James, tell me the truth. What are our actual chances of winning this? He stopped walking and turned to face me under a flickering streetlight. Legally, with Charles's will on our side and David Chen representing us, maybe 70-30 in our favor. But Victoria doesn't fight legal battles. She fights psychological warfare. She'll try to break you down emotionally, make you doubt yourself, convince you that you're in over your head and should just take whatever money she offers and disappear. And you think I'm strong enough to resist that? I think you've been resisting it your entire life. Every time you got up and went to work despite being exhausted, every time you chose to raise Sarah instead of taking the easy path, every time you kept searching for answers about your birth parents despite hitting dead ends, you were already fighting Victoria's influence. You just didn't know it. By the time Sarah's plane landed at SFO, I was running on pure nervous energy and approximately 6 cups of coffee. I watched her emerge from the terminal with her characteristic confidence. Even at 32, even dealing with the stress of her mother's crisis, she moved through the world like she belonged anywhere she chose to be. Mom. She wrapped me in a fierce hug that nearly brought me to tears all over again. You look terrible. When's the last time you slept? About 48 hours ago. Sarah, honey, there are some things I need to tell you before we meet with the lawyers. We found a quiet corner of the airport cafe and I explained everything. Victoria's cruelty, James's revelations about Charles, the trust fund, the board position, the impending legal battle. Sarah listened without interrupting, her expression growing more serious with each detail. $600 million, she said finally. Mom, do you realize what that means? It means Charles felt guilty about abandoning me and left us a lot of money to make up for it. It means you never have to worry about anything ever again. It means I can finally pay you back for all the sacrifices you made raising me. It means we have the power to help people the way we always wished we could, but never had the resources to do. I hadn't thought about it that way. I'd been so focused on the confrontation with Victoria and the legal complexities that I hadn't considered the positive possibilities of actually winning this fight. But there's something else, I said carefully. 50 million of that money is specifically designated for you. Charles wanted to provide for his granddaughter. Sarah's eyes widened. His granddaughter, but he never even met me. According to James, he followed your entire career. He was proud of you, Sarah, from a distance with no credit and no acknowledgement, but he was proud. Tears gathered in Sarah's eyes, and I realized she was experiencing her own version of what I'd felt learning about Charles's anonymous support over the years, the strange comfort of knowing someone had been watching over us, coupled with the sadness of missed connections. What do you want to do, Mom? This is your decision. I looked at my daughter, smart, successful, kind-hearted despite growing up with limited resources, and thought about the kind of opportunities that $50 million could create for her. Then I thought about Victoria's casual dismissal of both of us, her assumption that we could be bought off and silenced. I want to make them acknowledge us, I said firmly. Not as inconvenient mistakes to be managed, but as human beings who deserve basic respect. I want Victoria to understand that actions have consequences, even 67 years later. Sarah smiled, and for a moment she looked exactly like the determined little girl who'd announced at age 8 that she was going to be famous someday. Then let's go claim what's rightfully ours. David Chen's office was cramped but meticulously organized with law books stacked floor to ceiling and case files arranged with military precision. The man himself was in his early 50s, shorter than I'd expected, but with the kind of focused intensity that suggested he missed nothing important. Mrs. Williams, he said, shaking my hand with a grip that was surprisingly strong, James has told me about your situation. Before we begin, I want you to understand that taking on the Ashworth family will not be pleasant. Victoria has resources most people can only dream of, and she's not afraid to use them. So I keep hearing, but James says you have your own reasons for wanting to face her. David's expression hardened. 20 years ago, my father owned a small construction company that specialized in affordable housing. Victoria decided she wanted his land for a shopping center. When he refused to sell, she destroyed him. Trumped-up safety violations, bribed inspectors, spread rumors about his business practices. Within 6 months, he was bankrupt. Within a year, he was dead from the stress. The pain in his voice was still fresh after 2 decades. I'm sorry. Victoria Ashworth has been operating with impunity for far too long. If Charles's will gives us the legal standing to challenge her, then it's time someone made her accountable. Maria arrived just as David was explaining the complex legal framework surrounding the Ashworth family trusts. She took one look at the mountain of documents spread across his desk and whistled low. This is bigger than I thought, she said, settling into the chair beside me. Dorothy, are you sure you're ready for this level of complexity? No, I said honestly, but I'm ready to try. David spread out a series of legal documents pointing to specific clauses and provisions. Charles was extremely clever in how he structured his will. The bloodline inheritance clause can't be easily overturned because it's written into the original family trust from 1952. Victoria would need unanimous board approval to modify it, which means she needs your vote to eliminate your own rights. So she can't just lawyer her way around me. Not easily, but she can make your life extremely difficult while you're exercising those rights. Corporate board meetings, quarterly reviews, annual shareholder presentations. She'll use every opportunity to make you feel out of place and overwhelmed. James leaned forward. That's why we need to move quickly. File the paperwork today, establish Dorothy's legal standing before Victoria can implement whatever countermeasures she's planning. What kind of countermeasures? Sarah asked. David and James exchanged a look that made my stomach clench with worry. Victoria's first move will probably be to challenge your identity, David explained. She'll demand additional DNA testing, claim the original results were falsified, anything to delay the process. Then she'll attack your character, hire private investigators to dig up anything embarrassing from your past, spread rumors about your motives, suggest you're just a gold digger trying to exploit a grieving family. But I can prove I'm Charles's daughter. The DNA evidence is conclusive. Evidence doesn't matter if Victoria can convince key players that you're somehow fraudulent. She has relationships with judges, court clerks, media contacts. She can make your life very public and very uncomfortable very quickly. Maria had been taking notes throughout the conversation, and now she looked up with a determined expression. Then we need to control the narrative before she does. Dorothy, are you prepared to go public with your story? Really public. The thought terrified me. I'd lived my entire life as a private person, invisible to anyone outside my small circle of friends and family. The idea of having reporters dig into my background, photographers following me around my personal history splashed across newspapers and websites, made me feel physically sick. What would that accomplish? It would make you sympathetic, James said. Victoria's greatest vulnerability is public opinion. Her entire empire is built on maintaining the image of a respectable philanthropic family. If the story becomes billionaire abandons daughter, denies dying husband's wishes, she loses the moral high ground. But it also makes me a target for every crazy person and gold digger in the country, I pointed out. True, David acknowledged. But it also makes it much harder for Victoria to make you disappear quietly. Public scrutiny works both ways. Sarah had been quiet during this exchange, but now she spoke up. Mom, I have some connections in the media. People who specialize in human interest stories. Journalists who focus on social justice issues. Maybe we could control how this story gets told. What do you mean? Instead of letting Victoria's people frame this as a money grab, we frame it as a story about family accountability and honoring the wishes of a dying man. We make it about Charles wanting to reconnect with the daughter he was forced to give up, not about you trying to steal money from his widow. The strategy made sense, but the idea of exposing my private life to public scrutiny still made me deeply uncomfortable. And if Victoria retaliates, if she comes after you professionally, Sarah's smile was fierce. Let her try. I've been building my career for 15 years. I have relationships, contracts, projects in development. Victoria Ashworth might be powerful in the business world, but she doesn't control Hollywood. David had been reviewing Charles's will while we talked, and now he looked up with something approaching excitement. There's something else here, a provision I missed on first reading. Charles didn't just leave you voting rights and trust fund access. He left you the authority to audit all charitable expenditures made by the Ashworth Foundation. What does that mean? It means you can demand to see exactly how the family's philanthropic money has been spent. Every donation, every grant, every tax-deductible contribution for the past 20 years. If there are irregularities, if Victoria has been using charitable funds for personal purposes, David's smile was predatory. That's not just a civil matter, that's potential criminal fraud. James sat up straighter. Charles suspected something. That's why he included the audit provision. He knew Victoria was cutting corners somewhere, and he wanted to give you the tools to investigate. You think she's been stealing from her own charities? I think Victoria Ashworth has been playing fast and loose with other people's money for decades, David said grimly. Charles's will suggests he had evidence of financial improprieties. Finding that evidence could be the key to everything. The pieces were falling into place with frightening clarity. Charles hadn't just felt guilty about abandoning his daughter. He'd been planning a posthumous reckoning with his wife's business practices. The trust fund, the board seat, the audit authority, it was all designed to give me the power to hold Victoria accountable for years of questionable decisions. How do we start the audit? I asked. First, we file the paperwork establishing your legal standing. Then we formally request access to all foundation records. Victoria will probably refuse, which gives us grounds to go to court and demand judicial enforcement. Maria was still taking notes, but now she looked up with concern. This is moving very fast. Dorothy, are you sure you understand what you're committing to? This isn't just about getting acknowledgement from your birth mother anymore. You're talking about potentially exposing criminal activity by one of the most powerful families in California. She was right. What had started as a simple desire to meet my biological parents had evolved into something much larger and more dangerous. But I thought about Victoria's cruel dismissal, her assumption that I could be bought off, and silenced her casual destruction of David's father, and who knows how many other people over the years. I'm sure, I said firmly. File the paperwork. David nodded and began pulling forms from various files. I'll need you to sign here, and initial this page. Sarah, as a beneficiary of the trust, I'll need your signature as well. As we worked through the legal documents, my phone buzzed with another text from Victoria. Ms. Williams, I hope you've had time to reconsider our conversation yesterday. I'm prepared to make a very generous offer that would benefit everyone involved. Shall we meet at 2 p.m. as planned? I showed the message to James, who grinned. She has no idea what's about to hit her. What should I tell her? Tell her you'll be there, but don't mention the lawyers, the paperwork, or the audit. Let her think you're coming to negotiate a buyout. I typed back, I'll see you at 2 p.m. We have a lot to discuss. There, David said, finishing the last form. As of this moment, Dorothy Williams is officially recognized as a legitimate heir to the Ashworth Family Trust with full voting rights and audit authority. Victoria's about to have a very bad day. Sarah squeezed my hand. How do you feel, Mom? I thought about the question. How did I feel? Terrified, certainly, overwhelmed by the complexity of what we were attempting, but underneath the fear was something else, a sense of rightness, of finally having the power to fight back after a lifetime of accepting whatever circumstances life handed me. I feel like Charles's daughter, I said finally. For the first time in my life, I feel like I have the right to demand answers from people who think they're untouchable. David began organizing the filed paperwork into a briefcase. I'll deliver copies of these documents to Victoria's office at exactly 1 o'clock. That gives her 1 hour to review them before your meeting. Should be just enough time for panic to set in. What do you think she'll do when she realizes I'm not coming to negotiate a quiet buyout? James's expression was grim. She'll do what she always does when cornered. She'll attack. Victoria's never been in a situation where she couldn't intimidate, or manipulate her way to victory. This is going to be completely outside her experience. And that makes her more dangerous, not less, Maria added. Desperate, powerful people make unpredictable choices. As we prepared to leave David's office, he handed me a thick folder containing copies of all the legal documents we'd filed. Keep these with you at all times. Victoria will probably demand to see them, question their authenticity, maybe even try to have them confiscated somehow. Don't let them out of your possession. Sarah and I walked out into the bright San Francisco morning, the fog rolling in from the bay carrying the salt smell of the ocean. In a few hours, I would walk back into Victoria Ashworth's mansion, but this time I wouldn't be going as a desperate woman seeking acknowledgement from her birth mother. I would be going as Charles's daughter, armed with legal authority and the power to demand answers. Mom, Sarah said as we climbed into my Honda, whatever happens in there today, I want you to know how proud I am of you. You could have walked away yesterday, taken whatever money she offered, and lived quietly for the rest of your life. But you chose to fight instead. I chose to fight for you, I corrected. Charles left you $50 million, Sarah. Victoria had no right to sit on that money for 2 years, hoping you'd never find out about it. It's not about the money for me either, Sal, Sarah said quietly. It's about the principle. It's about not letting people like Victoria get away with treating others as disposable. As we drove back toward Napa Valley, I thought about the conversation ahead. Victoria would be expecting a frightened old woman seeking handouts. Instead, she was going to face Charles's daughter, backed by legal authority and determined to hold her accountable for decades of callous choices. The iron gates of the Ashworth estate came into view, and I felt my pulse quicken. But this time it wasn't from fear or nervousness. This time it was from anticipation. Victoria Ashworth was about to learn that some actions have consequences, even when they're committed by people who think they're too powerful to be held accountable. And those consequences were walking through her front door in exactly 30 minutes. The security guard at the Ashworth estate gates looked surprised to see me again so soon, but this time I wasn't driving alone. Sarah sat beside me in the passenger seat, and James followed in his Mercedes with Maria and David Chen. We formed a small convoy of determination, rolling up the perfectly manicured driveway. "Mom, your hands are shaking," Sarah observed, as I parked next to the same collection of luxury vehicles I'd seen yesterday. "Yesterday, I was begging for scraps of acknowledgement," I said, gripping the steering wheel to steady myself. "Today, I'm walking in there as an equal. It's terrifying." Eleanor Martinez met us at the front door, her professional composure intact, but her eyes showing a flicker of something that might have been satisfaction. "Mrs. Ashworth is waiting in the library," she said formally. Then, lowering her voice, she added, "She received some documents an hour ago. She's not pleased." David Chen smiled grimly. "Good. Angry people make mistakes." And we followed Eleanor through corridors I was beginning to recognize past the same priceless artwork and marble floors that had intimidated me 24 hours earlier. But now I saw them differently, not as symbols of unattainable wealth, but as assets of a company I partially owned, art purchased with profits from a business I had legal rights to audit. The library was a magnificent room with floor-to-ceiling bookshelves and leather furniture that looked like it belonged in an English manor house. Victoria stood with her back to us, staring out a tall window at her vineyard, but I could see the tension in her shoulders, the rigid way she held herself when she was preparing for battle. "Mrs. Ashworth," David announced formally, "I'm David Chen representing Dorothy Williams and Sarah Martinez in this matter." Victoria turned slowly, and I was struck by how much she'd changed since yesterday. The composed mask was still in place, but there were cracks around the edges, lines of strain around her eyes, a tightness in her jaw that suggested she'd been grinding her teeth. The legal documents had clearly rattled her more than she wanted to admit. "Mr. Chen," she said coolly, "I know who you are. Your father tried to extort money from my family 20 years ago. I see the apple doesn't fall far from the tree." David's expression didn't change, but I saw Sarah stiffen beside me. "My father was an honest businessman who refused to be bullied by your illegal tactics, but we're not here to relitigate the past. We're here to discuss the future of the Ashworth Family Trust." "There is no discussion to be had," Victoria replied, moving to her desk where the legal documents David had filed were spread out like evidence of a crime. "These papers are fraudulent. This woman has no legal claim to anything connected to the Ashworth family." "The DNA evidence says otherwise," Maria interjected, speaking for the first time, "as does the birth certificate, adoption records, and Charles's will, all of which have been verified by independent laboratories and legal experts." Victoria's laugh was sharp as broken glass. "Charles's will was read 2 years ago. There was no mention of any alleged daughter." "That was the public reading," James said quietly from where he stood near the door. "You know as well as I do that Charles left private instructions regarding Dorothy and Sarah." For the first time since we'd entered the room, Victoria's mask slipped completely. She turned on James with fury that was almost physical in its intensity. "You. I should have known you were behind this pathetic scheme. After everything I've done for you, everything I've taught you, you betray the family that raised you for a complete stranger." "Dorothy isn't a stranger," James replied calmly. "She's Charles's daughter. She's family. Something you seem to have forgotten the meaning of." "Family, Victoria's voice rose to a near shout. "I'll tell you what family means. Family means loyalty. Family means protecting what generations have built. Family means making hard choices to ensure survival. This woman, she gestured at me with dismissive contempt, is not family. She's a genetic accident that we corrected 67 years ago. Sarah stood up, her Hollywood training evident in the way she commanded the room's attention with a simple movement. My mother didn't come here yesterday asking for money or demanding recognition she hadn't earned. She came looking for basic human decency from the people who created her. And you responded with cruelty that would shame a stranger, let alone a biological parent. Victoria turned her cold gaze on Sarah, and I saw her taking in my daughter's designer clothes, her confident posture, her unmistakable air of success. Ah, yes, the adopted granddaughter. How touching that the unwanted raised another unwanted child. Tell me, dear, how much money are you hoping to extort from this elaborate charade? $50 million, Sarah said without hesitation. That's what your husband left me in his will. Money you've been sitting on for 2 years, hoping I'd never learn it existed. The number hung in the air like a bomb waiting to explode. Victoria's face went pale, and for a moment I thought she might actually faint. She'd clearly assumed that Sarah didn't know about her inheritance, that she could be dismissed as easily as she'd tried to dismiss me. That money comes with conditions, Victoria stammered. Legal obligations, behavioral requirements. Actually, it doesn't, David said, consulting his copy of Charles's will. The trust for Sarah Martinez is unconditional and unrestricted. She could claim it tomorrow if she chose to. And Victoria sank into the chair behind her desk, suddenly looking every one of her 73 years. What do you want? She asked quietly. We want you to honor Charles's wishes, I said, finding my voice for the first time since entering the room. We want you to acknowledge that he had the right to leave his money to whomever he chose, and we want you to explain why you've been sitting on these trusts for 2 years instead of executing them as legally required. Charles was emotional at the end, sentimental. He wasn't thinking clearly about the implications of his decisions. Charles was brilliant until the day he died, James interrupted. His mind was sharp, his judgment sound. The only thing that wasn't clear was why he let you control his relationship with his daughter for 67 years. Victoria's composure was cracking in real time. You have no idea what you're interfering with. This family, this company, everything we've built requires careful management, strategic planning. Introducing unknown variables at this stage could destroy everything. What unknown variables? Maria asked sharply. Dorothy wants to claim her legal inheritance and exercise her board voting rights. Sarah wants access to her trust fund. These are straightforward legal matters, not corporate espionage. Board voting rights, Victoria repeated, her voice barely a whisper. 30%, David confirmed, plus audit authority over all foundation expenditures. Charles wanted to ensure that the family's charitable work continued to meet his standards. The mention of audit authority hit Victoria like a physical blow. She went absolutely white, gripping the edge of her desk so hard her knuckles stood out like marble. There will be no audit, she said with desperate firmness. The Foundation's books are private family business. Actually, they're public record, Maria pointed out. As a registered charitable organization, the Ashworth Foundation is required to file annual reports with both state and federal authorities. The only question is whether Dorothy exercises her right to internal audit or whether we request external investigation through the Attorney General's office. Victoria was trapped, and everyone in the room knew it. The carefully constructed empire she'd spent decades building was suddenly vulnerable to scrutiny from someone she couldn't buy, intimidate, or control. For the first time in her adult life, Victoria Ashworth was facing consequences she couldn't simply lawyer her way around. How much? She asked finally. Name your price. All of you. I'll write checks today if you'll sign non-disclosure agreements and walk away from this nonsense. There is no price, but I said firmly. I didn't come here for money, Victoria. I came here for truth. And now that I know Charles wanted me to have legal standing in this family, I'm going to use it. You don't understand what you're doing, Victoria said, desperation creeping into her voice. This isn't just about you or your hurt feelings or some fantasy of family reconciliation. There are thousands of jobs at stake, charitable programs that help vulnerable people, investments, and partnerships that affect entire communities. Then you should have thought of that before you spent 2 years violating Charles's will, James said coldly. Before you tried to cheat Dorothy and Sarah out of their rightful inheritance. Before you built your empire on a foundation of lies and manipulation. Victoria turned on James with renewed fury. Lies, manipulation. Everything I've done to protect this family's legacy, to ensure that what we built survives and prospers. Unlike Charles, I understand that sentiment is a luxury we can't afford. What sentiment are we talking about? Sarah asked innocently. The sentiment of honoring a dying man's wishes, the sentiment of acknowledging your own biological daughter, the sentiment of treating human beings with basic decency, the sentiment of letting emotions override practical necessity, Victoria snapped. Charles wanted to salve his guilty conscience by throwing money at a problem we solved 67 years ago. He wanted to feel better about a decision that was absolutely correct at the time. Correct for whom? I asked. Correct for you and Charles, maybe. But what about correct for the baby you threw away? What about correct for the child who grew up wondering why she wasn't worth keeping? What about correct for the woman who spent 67 years feeling like there was something fundamentally wrong with her? Victoria's mask slammed back down with almost audible force. You were placed with appropriate caregivers who could provide for your needs. Anything else is self-indulgent emotionalism. And the anonymous financial help Charles provided over the years, David asked, the hospital bills, the scholarships, the emergency grants that appeared whenever Dorothy and Sarah needed them most. Was that self-indulgent emotionalism too? Victoria went very still. I don't know what you're talking about. Of course you do, James said quietly. You fought Charles about it constantly. You thought he was being weak, letting his emotions compromise his judgment. But he kept helping them anyway, didn't he? Behind your back through shell companies and fake foundations and charitable funds, you couldn't trace back to him directly. The silence that followed was deafening. Victoria stared at James with something approaching hatred, while the rest of us absorbed the implications of what he'd revealed. Charles hadn't just felt guilty about abandoning his daughter. He'd been actively defying Victoria's wishes to help us for decades. He never stopped loving you, James continued, speaking directly to me. Victoria convinced him that contact would be harmful, that it was better for everyone if he stayed away. But he never stopped watching over you, never stopped trying to make sure you and Sarah had opportunities he couldn't give you directly. Tears I'd been holding back since yesterday finally broke free. The man I'd never met, the father I'd never known, had been part of my life all along. Every time money had appeared when we needed it most, every scholarship or grant, or mysteriously forgiven debt, it had been Charles loving us from a distance, doing what he could, despite the woman who controlled his life. You knew, I said to Victoria through my tears. You knew he was helping us, and you let me think it was just luck or charity from strangers. Victoria's voice was ice cold. I knew Charles was being foolish. I knew he was letting guilt cloud his judgment. I tried to protect him from his own weakness. His weakness? Sarah stood up, her voice shaking with anger. You call love weakness. You call caring about your own child weakness. I call it impractical, Victoria replied. Love doesn't build empires. Love doesn't create lasting legacies. Love doesn't make the hard choices necessary for survival in a competitive world. But it does create human connections, Maria said quietly. It does inspire loyalty and dedication from employees, donors, community partners. It does build the kind of reputation that can't be bought with publicity campaigns or charitable tax write-offs. Victoria laughed bitterly. How wonderfully naive. You think this business runs on warm feelings and good intentions. You think our success comes from being nice to people. This is a multi-billion-dollar empire built on making smart decisions and eliminating threats before they can cause problems. Is that what my mother was? Sarah asked. A threat to be eliminated. Your mother was a complication that could have destroyed everything Charles and I worked for. In 1958, an illegitimate child would have ruined our social standing, ended our business relationships, made us pariahs in the very circles we needed to succeed. And now, I asked, in 2025, is acknowledging your daughter still a threat to your precious empire? Victoria was quiet for a long moment, staring at the legal documents spread across her desk. When she looked up, her expression was calculating rather than emotional. Now you're a different kind of threat. Now you have legal standing to interfere with strategic decisions, to question business practices, to audit expenditures that are none of your concern. Now you're not just a personal embarrassment, you're a practical problem that could cost this company millions of dollars and hundreds of jobs. David leaned forward in his chair. What expenditures are you so concerned about, Mrs. Ashworth? What business practices are you afraid Dorothy might discover? I'm not afraid of anything, Victoria said quickly. Too quickly. Then you won't object to the audit? Maria said smoothly. If the Foundation's books are clean, if all charitable expenditures have been properly documented and legally distributed, then Dorothy's review will simply confirm your excellent stewardship. Victoria's silence spoke volumes. She was terrified of the audit, which meant there were definitely irregularities to be found. Charles had suspected as much when he included the audit authority in his will. He'd given me the tools to expose whatever questionable practices Victoria had been hiding. What did you do? James asked, his voice carrying a mixture of dread and fascination. Victoria, what did you do with the Foundation money? I managed it appropriately, Paul, Victoria said defensively. Every expenditure was carefully considered, properly documented, legally justified. But not necessarily charitable, David pressed. The Foundation has received tax-exempt status based on its commitment to genuine charitable work. If funds have been diverted to personal use or used to benefit family business interests or employed as political contributions disguised as charitable donations, that would constitute fraud, Maria finished. Multiple felonies carrying significant prison sentences. The word prison hit Victoria like a physical blow. For the first time since I'd met her, she looked genuinely frightened, rather than just angry or frustrated. Her carefully constructed world of wealth and power and influence suddenly seemed fragile, vulnerable to collapse if the wrong secrets came to light. You can't prove anything, she said, but her voice lacked conviction. We don't have to prove anything, I said, finally understanding the full scope of what Charles had given me. I just have to exercise my legal right to audit the books. If there's nothing to hide, the audit will confirm that. If there is something to hide, I let the implication hang in the air. Victoria stood up abruptly, pacing to the window like a caged animal. You have no idea what you're threatening to destroy. This company employs 8,000 people, directly supports dozens of charitable organizations, contributes millions to community development projects. If you destabilize our operations with frivolous investigations, if you create public relations disasters with unfounded accusations, innocent people will suffer. Then maybe you should have thought about that before you violated your fiduciary duties, James said coldly. Before you used charitable funds for personal benefit, before you built your empire on a foundation of fraud and deception. Victoria whirled around to face him. Everything I've done to ensure this family's survival and success. Every difficult decision, every strategic compromise, every hard choice, it was all to protect what we built together. What about protecting the daughter you built it on the foundation of abandoning? Sarah asked. What about protecting Charles's right to make his own decisions about his own money? What about protecting the thousands of people who donated to your charities believing their money would actually help people in need? Victoria looked around the room at the faces arrayed against her, her nephew, her biological daughter, her granddaughter, and the lawyers who'd spent years waiting for an opportunity to hold her accountable. For the first time in decades, Victoria Ashworth was completely outnumbered and outmaneuvered. "What do you want?" she asked again, but this time the question carried defeat rather than defiance. "We want full disclosure," I said firmly, "complete transparency about how foundation funds have been spent, public acknowledgement of Charles's wishes regarding his biological family, and immediate release of all trust funds that have been illegally withheld." "And if I refuse?" David smiled with predatory satisfaction. "Then we file criminal complaints with the Attorney General's office, request federal investigation of charitable fraud, and hold a press conference explaining why Charles Ashworth's dying wishes have been ignored by his surviving widow." "You wouldn't dare. The media attention would destroy both of you as much as it would hurt me." Sarah laughed. "Victoria, I'm a professional actress. Media attention is literally my job, and my mother has spent 67 years being invisible. I think she's ready to tell her story to the world." Victoria sank back into her chair, the fight finally draining out of her. "You don't understand the consequences of what you're demanding. This isn't just about money or acknowledgement or family drama. There are business relationships, political connections, international partnerships that could be jeopardized by the wrong kind of scrutiny." "Then you should have considered those consequences before you chose to defy Charles's will," Maria said without sympathy. "Your legal and ethical obligations were clear. You chose to ignore them for 2 years, hoping Dorothy and Sarah would never surface. Now you're facing the natural results of that decision." Victoria was quiet for several minutes, staring at the legal documents that had transformed her from predator to prey in the span of a single day. When she finally looked up, her expression was that of someone calculating the least damaging way to surrender. "The audit will take months," she said finally. "It will disrupt business operations, create negative publicity, raise questions about our management practices." "Good." I said simply. Maybe it's time those questions were raised. Victoria's last desperate gambit was to appeal directly to James. "You're destroying your own inheritance," she told him. "If these investigations damage the company's reputation, if our stock price collapses, if we lose major contracts, your future becomes worthless. Everything I've been building for you disappears." James met her gaze steadily. "Maybe that's not such a bad thing. Maybe it's time the Ashworth family fortune was built on something other than cruelty and deception." The defeat in Victoria's eyes was complete. She reached into her desk drawer and withdrew a thick folder, placing it on the desk between us. "These are Charles's private instructions regarding the trust funds," she said quietly. "The ones I've been postponing implementation of. There are also some personal items he wanted Dorothy to have. Letters, photographs, family documents." My hands shook as I reached for the folder. Inside were legal papers confirming everything David had explained about the trust funds, but also handwritten letters in an unfamiliar script. Letters addressed to me, written over the course of decades but never sent. "He wrote to you," Victoria said, her voice barely audible, "every year on your birthday, every Christmas, whenever something significant happened in your life. He wrote letters he knew he could never send, explanations he knew you'd never read." I opened the first letter, dated just 3 months after my birth, and saw words that blurred through my tears. "My dearest daughter, Dorothy, I think about you every day and wonder if we made the right choice. I pray that wherever you are, you're safe and loved and happy. I pray that someday you'll understand that giving you up was the hardest thing I've ever done." Sarah read over my shoulder, her own eyes filling with tears. "He never stopped thinking about you, Mom. He never stopped caring." Victoria watched us discover Charles's secret emotional life with something that might have been regret flickering in her eyes. "He loved you both," she admitted quietly. "More than I understood at the time, more than I wanted to acknowledge." "Then why," I asked through my tears. Why did you fight so hard to keep us apart? Why did you sit on his will for 2 years? Why couldn't you just let him have this one connection to the daughter he'd lost? Victoria was quiet for so long I thought she wasn't going to answer. When she finally spoke, her voice carried a vulnerability I hadn't heard before. Because I was afraid, she said simply, afraid that if Charles reconnected with you, he'd realize that all the sacrifices we'd made, all the difficult choices, all the people we'd hurt along the way, none of it was worth the cost of losing his daughter. I was afraid he'd choose you over everything we'd built together. The admission hung in the air like a confession. Victoria Ashworth, the ice-cold businesswoman who'd built an empire on calculated cruelty, had spent 67 years terrified that her husband would discover what she'd cost him when she'd forced him to abandon his child. He wouldn't have left you, James said quietly. Charles loved you, Victoria. He would have found a way to have both, his family business and his biological daughter. Maybe, Victoria said, but I couldn't take that risk. I'd invested too much, sacrificed too much to lose everything to a sentimental reunion. So you chose to lose your humanity instead, Sarah observed. Victoria's smile was bitter. Humanity is expensive. Success requires making choices that more sentimental people can't stomach. I've never regretted prioritizing practical concerns over emotional ones. Until now, I asked. Victoria looked at me for a long moment, studying my face as if seeing it clearly for the first time. Until now, I never had to face the actual consequences of those choices. You were theoretical and abstract problem that could be managed from a distance. But sitting here looking at Charles's letters, seeing the woman you became, despite everything we put you through, she trailed off, shaking her head. I'm not looking for an apology, I said firmly. I'm looking for acknowledgement that Charles had the right to make his own choices about his own family. I'm looking for respect for the woman who raised your biological granddaughter. I'm looking for basic human decency from the people who share my DNA. Victoria nodded slowly. The trust funds will be released immediately. The audit can proceed with full cooperation from our accounting department. And James is right. It's time the Ashworth family built its legacy on something other than fear and manipulation. As we gathered our documents and prepared to leave, Victoria called out one final question. Dorothy, what happens now? Between us, I mean. Do you expect some kind of ongoing relationship? I considered the question carefully. This woman had carried me for 9 months, given birth to me, then spent 67 years pretending I didn't exist. She'd caused immeasurable pain through her deliberate cruelty, but she'd also just surrendered completely and agreed to honor Charles's wishes. I don't know, I said honestly. I'm not sure we can build a relationship on the foundation of everything that's happened, but maybe we can build something new. Maybe we can learn to treat each other with the respect that family members should show each other even when they don't particularly like each other. Victoria's smile was sad but genuine. That seems like more than I deserve, but perhaps more than I dared hope for. As we walked out of the Ashworth mansion for what I suspected might be the last time Sarah squeezed my hand. How do you feel now, Mom? I thought about Charles's letters in my bag, about the $50 million Sarah would soon have access to, about the audit that would finally expose Victoria's decades of questionable practices. I thought about the board seat that would give me a voice in decisions affecting thousands of employees and community organizations. I feel like I finally have the power to make sure Charles's real legacy survives, I said. Not Victoria's empire built on cruelty, but his vision of a family business that actually takes care of people. The gates of the Ashworth estate closed behind us one final time, but this time I wasn't driving away in defeat. This time I was driving toward a future where actions had consequences, where dying wishes were honored, and where a 67-year-old woman finally had the resources to build the kind of world she'd always dreamed of. 3 weeks later, I sat in what had once been Charles's private office, now temporarily mine, as I exercised my audit authority over the Ashworth Foundation. The mahogany desk was covered with financial records, bank statements, and canceled checks that told a story of systematic fraud spanning nearly 2 decades. Each document I reviewed made my stomach turn a little more. "This is worse than we thought," David Chen said, looking up from a stack of invoices. She wasn't just diverting charitable funds for personal use. She was running an elaborate money laundering operation disguised as philanthropy. Sarah sat across from me, her laptop open to a spreadsheet where she'd been tracking the suspicious transactions we'd uncovered. "Mom, look at this pattern." Every time the foundation received a large donation, Victoria would immediately transfer matching amounts to shell companies owned by Ashworth Business Associates. The charity money went in circles, but it always ended up benefiting family business interests. Maria whistled low as she examined a particularly damning set of documents. "This isn't just fraud. This is racketeering." Victoria used charitable donations to pay bribes, fund illegal political contributions, even finance hostile takeovers of competing businesses. The IRS is going to have a field day with this. I picked up one of Charles's letters from the folder Victoria had given me, rereading his words from 15 years ago. "Dorothy, I'm growing increasingly concerned about some of Victoria's financial decisions. I've tried to discuss my worries with her, but she dismisses my concerns as weakness. I'm documenting everything I can find, hoping that someday someone with the authority to act will hold her accountable." "He knew," I said quietly. Charles suspected what she was doing, but he didn't have the evidence to stop her. That's why he structured his will the way he did. He was giving me the tools to finish what he couldn't. James walked in carrying coffee for everyone, his expression grim. "I just got off the phone with our head of human resources. Victoria's been quietly liquidating employee pension funds to cover the foundation's financial shortfalls. 8,000 people think they have retirement security, but the money's been borrowed against so heavily that the accounts are essentially worthless." The magnitude of Victoria's betrayal was staggering. Not content with abandoning her own daughter and defrauding charitable donors, she'd also been stealing from the people who dedicated their careers to building the Ashworth empire. The cruelty was systematic, calculated, and breathtakingly comprehensive. "How much money are we talking about?" I asked. David had been running calculations on his laptop throughout the morning. "Conservative estimate, Victoria has misappropriated approximately $400 million over the past 20 years. That includes charitable funds, employee benefits, tax-deductible donations that never reached their intended recipients, and business loans secured with fraudulent collateral." $400 million. The number was so large it didn't feel real, but the evidence was spread across the desk in front of me. Thousands of small betrayals that had added up to a massive criminal enterprise. "What's our legal obligation here?" Sarah asked. "Can we just demand restitution and keep this quiet, or do we have to report it to authorities?" Maria's expression was firm. "We have to report it. This isn't a civil matter anymore. It's criminal fraud on a massive scale. The Attorney General's office needs to know, the IRS needs to know, and frankly, the FBI probably needs to know. Victoria hasn't just been stealing money. She's been using that money to corrupt government officials and manipulate business deals." My phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "Dorothy, this is Victoria. I know what you're finding in those files. We need to talk before you do something that will hurt innocent people. Can we meet privately?" I showed the message to the others, who read it with various expressions of disgust and disbelief. "She's still trying to control the narrative," James said. "Even with the evidence of her crime spread out in front of us, Victoria thinks she can manipulate her way out of consequences." What should I tell her? David considered this carefully. "Tell her you'll meet with her, but not privately. Tell her any conversation needs to happen with legal representation present. And Dorothy, whatever she offers you, whatever sob story she tells about protecting innocent employees or charitable organizations, remember that she's had 20 years to do the right thing and she chose fraud instead." I typed back, "I'll meet with you tomorrow at 2 p.m. in David Chen's office. Bring your lawyer." The response came immediately. "This requires privacy. There are things you don't understand about the broader implications of your discoveries. Some secrets are kept to protect people, not to harm them. She's terrified, Sarah observed. Victoria Ashworth, the Ice Queen, who's never shown fear of anything, is genuinely terrified of what we're going to do with this information. Good, I said firmly. She should be terrified. She spent decades terrorizing other people, employees who asked inconvenient questions, competitors who got in her way, journalists who investigated too closely. Now it's her turn to feel powerless. That evening, I drove back to my apartment in Sacramento to collect more of my belongings. The small space that had been my home for 23 years now felt like a relic from another life. In a few weeks, I'd have access to enough money to live anywhere I wanted, do anything I chose, help anyone who needed it. But first, I needed to figure out what justice looked like for Victoria's victims. I spread Charles's letters across my kitchen table and read them chronologically, watching his growing concern about Victoria's behavior evolve into active documentation of her crimes. In his final letter, written just a month before he died, he'd been remarkably prescient. Dorothy, if you're reading this, then Victoria has finally gone too far and someone needs to hold her accountable. I've left you the legal authority to investigate because I believe you have the strength and moral clarity that I lacked. Don't let her manipulate you into believing that protecting the company requires protecting her crimes. The Ashworth empire can survive scandal, but it can't survive the systematic corruption she's built it on. My phone rang, interrupting my reading. Sarah's name appeared on the screen. Mom, you need to see the news. Turn on Channel 7. I fumbled for the remote and found the local news station where a perfectly coiffed reporter was standing outside the Ashworth corporate headquarters. Exclusive investigation has revealed serious questions about the financial management of the Ashworth Family Foundation, one of Northern California's largest charitable organizations. Sources close to the investigation suggest that hundreds of millions of dollars in charitable donations may have been misappropriated over the past 2 decades. My heart stopped. Sarah, we didn't release any information to the media. How did they find out? I don't know, but Mom, this changes everything. Victoria can't control the narrative anymore. The story's public now. The reporter continued. The investigation was reportedly initiated by Dorothy Williams, recently discovered to be the biological daughter of the late Charles Ashworth, who used legal authority granted in his will to audit foundation expenditures. Mrs. Williams could not be reached for comment, but sources suggest that the evidence of financial improprieties is substantial and may result in criminal charges. I stared at the television in shock. Someone had leaked our investigation to the media, and now my name was attached to the biggest financial scandal in Northern California history. The privacy I'd treasured for 67 years was about to disappear forever. My phone started ringing continuously, reporters, I assumed, tracking down my number and address. I turned it off and tried to think clearly about what this media attention would mean for our investigation, for Victoria's ability to destroy evidence for my own safety and privacy. The next morning, I arrived at David Chen's office to find a circus. Television news trucks lined the narrow Chinatown street, reporters with cameras interviewing anyone who would speak to them, photographers trying to get shots through the office windows. David met me at a side entrance, ushering me through an alley to avoid the media frenzy. How bad is this? I asked as we climbed the stairs to his office. Depends on your perspective, David replied grimly. Bad if you wanted to handle this quietly through official channels. Good if you want to ensure Victoria can't make this problem disappear with bribes and political connections. The public scrutiny makes it much harder for her to manipulate the outcome. Sarah and Maria were already waiting in the conference room, along with James and a woman I didn't recognize, tall, serious-looking, wearing the kind of expensive suit that suggested government authority. Dorothy, this is Agent Jennifer Walsh from the FBI's white-collar crime unit, David said by way of introduction. The media attention accelerated some timelines. Agent Walsh shook my hand with a firm grip. Mrs. Williams, I understand you've uncovered evidence of systematic financial fraud connected to the Ashworth Foundation. We'd like to discuss federal cooperation in your investigation. The FBI. The magnitude of what we'd stumbled into was becoming clearer by the hour. This wasn't just about Victoria's cruelty to her abandoned daughter or even her theft from charitable organizations. This was about a decades-long criminal enterprise that had corrupted businesses, politicians, and charitable organizations across multiple states. What kind of cooperation? I asked. We'd like to formalize your audit under federal oversight, Agent Walsh explained. That gives us the authority to seize records, freeze accounts, and prevent destruction of evidence. It also provides legal protection for you and your family against retaliation. Retaliation, James spoke up from across the table. Victoria's already started. She's hired a crisis management firm, a team of private investigators, and some very expensive criminal defense attorneys. She's also been reaching out to business associates who might be implicated in the foundation fraud, trying to coordinate their responses. My stomach clenched with anxiety. What kind of retaliation are we talking about? Agent Walsh's expression was serious. Financial crimes of this magnitude often involve people with significant resources and few scruples. Mrs. Ashworth has spent decades building relationships with individuals who have strong incentives to keep this information from becoming public. We recommend taking some basic security precautions. Security precautions. 24 hours ago, I'd been a retired paralegal living quietly in Sacramento. Now I was apparently in need of federal protection from people wealthy enough to make problems disappear permanently. There's something else, Sarah said quietly. I got a call this morning from my agent. Someone's been calling Hollywood studios, spreading rumors about my family background, suggesting I might be involved in some kind of financial scandal. Victoria's trying to destroy my career as leverage against you. The personal nature of Victoria's attack hit me like a physical blow. It was one thing to threaten me. I'd survived 67 years of hardship and could probably survive whatever she threw at me. But going after Sarah's livelihood, trying to destroy the career she'd spent 15 years building, was unconscionably vicious even by Victoria's standards. We can protect against that, Agent Walsh said. Federal investigation provides certain immunities for witnesses and family members. Your daughter's cooperation with a criminal investigation actually makes her a more sympathetic figure, not a liability. Before I could respond, David's secretary knocked on the conference room door. Mr. Chen Victoria Ashworth is here with her attorneys. She says she has an appointment. Through the window, I could see Victoria climbing out of a black town car flanked by 3 men in expensive suits who were clearly lawyers. Even facing potential federal charges, she moved with the confidence of someone accustomed to getting her way through sheer force of personality. Should we see her? I asked. Agent Walsh nodded. Federal investigators are very interested in anything Mrs. Ashworth has to say about these allegations. We'll be recording the conversation for evidentiary purposes. And Victoria entered the conference room like a general surveying a battlefield, her gaze taking in each person present and calculating their potential threat level. When she saw Agent Walsh, I watched her mask of confidence slip for just a moment before slamming back into place. Agent Walsh, she said calmly, I assume your presence indicates that certain people have been making wild accusations to federal authorities. Mrs. Ashworth, I'm here because evidence of systematic financial fraud has been brought to our attention, evidence your stepdaughter discovered while exercising her legal audit authority. Victoria's lawyers immediately began the careful dance of trying to control their client's exposure while gathering information about the federal investigation. But Victoria herself seemed less interested in legal strategy than in making one final attempt to manipulate me directly. Dorothy, she said, speaking to me as if we were alone in the room, I want you to understand what you're destroying. 8,000 jobs, dozens of charitable organizations, community development projects that benefit hundreds of thousands of people. You're so focused on punishing me for ancient history that you're willing to sacrifice all of that for revenge. I'm not destroying anything, oh, I replied calmly. I'm exposing what you destroyed 20 years ago when you decided to steal money meant for people who needed help. I'm revealing what you destroyed when you chose personal enrichment over fiduciary responsibility. Those are very serious allegations, one of Victoria's lawyers interjected. My client denies any wrongdoing and questions the validity of this so-called audit. David spread some of the most damning evidence across the table: bank statements showing foundation money being transferred to shell companies, invoices for personal expenses paid with charitable funds, tax documents claiming deductions for donations that never reached their supposed recipients. Your client's signature is on most of these documents, David said calmly, along with handwritten notes in what appears to be her personal handwriting directing the transfer of charitable funds to business associates and family members. Victoria studied the documents with the expression of someone seeing them for the first time, but I caught a flicker of recognition in her eyes. She knew exactly what we'd found because she'd been the one authorizing these transactions for 2 decades. Those transfers were legitimate business expenses, she said finally: consulting fees, administrative costs, operational overhead. Administrative overhead that happened to pay for your nephew's wedding, Sarah asked, pointing to a particularly egregious example. Consulting fees that went directly to companies owned by your personal friends, operational costs that covered the down payment on your Napa Valley estate. Victoria's composure was cracking again, but this time it was being replaced by something more dangerous than fear: desperate calculation. You have no idea what you're interfering with, she said, her voice carrying an edge of threat. There are business relationships, political arrangements, international agreements that depend on maintaining certain discretions. If you force full disclosure of foundation operations, if you insist on federal investigation of every financial transaction, you'll be causing problems that extend far beyond my personal situation. Agent Walsh leaned forward with interest. What kind of international agreements, Mrs. Ashworth? Victoria's lawyers immediately tried to stop her from speaking further, but she seemed past the point of listening to legal advice. The kind that ensure American business interests are protected in emerging markets, she said, the kind that require unofficial channels and creative financing structures, the kind that bureaucrats and federal agents wouldn't understand or appreciate. You mean bribes, James said bluntly. You've been using foundation money to pay bribes to foreign officials, haven't you? The silence that followed was deafening. Victoria's lawyers looked like they wanted to physically restrain their client from speaking, while Agent Walsh took careful notes of everything she just admitted. I've ensured that American companies could compete effectively in global markets, Victoria said defiantly. I've protected thousands of jobs and billions in revenue through strategic relationship management. If that's a crime, then every successful international business leader in America is a criminal. It is a crime, Agent Walsh said quietly. It's called the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, and violations carry sentences of up to 20 years in federal prison. The room went absolutely silent. Victoria stared at Agent Walsh with something approaching shock. Apparently, she genuinely believed that her international bribery schemes were somehow legitimate business practices rather than serious federal crimes. Mrs. Ashworth, one of her lawyers said urgently, I strongly advise you to stop talking immediately. But Victoria seemed beyond legal advice, now driven by a combination of desperation and the kind of arrogance that comes from decades of getting away with increasingly serious crimes. Dorothy, she said, turning back to me with something that might have been genuine pleading in her voice, you have the power to stop this. You can call off the audit, refuse to cooperate with federal investigators, take your trust fund money, and walk away from all of this. Charles left you that authority precisely so you could make these kinds of decisions. Charles left me that authority so I could hold you accountable, I replied. He spent his final years documenting your crimes because he knew someone would eventually need to expose them. I'm not walking away from that responsibility. Victoria's mask finally slipped, completely revealing the calculating predator underneath. Then you're destroying your own inheritance. When federal investigators seize company assets, when stockholders discover the extent of regulatory violations, when international business relationships collapse, the Ashworth empire becomes worthless. Your $600 million trust fund disappears along with everything else. Good, I said simply. If the Ashworth fortune was built on fraud and bribery and stolen money, then it deserves to disappear. Maybe it's time to build something new on a foundation that doesn't require destroying other people's lives. Agent Walsh stood up, signaling the end of the meeting. Mrs. Ashworth, based on your statements today and the evidence Mrs. Williams has provided, I'll be recommending that the Bureau open a full investigation into the Ashworth Foundation's financial practices. You should expect federal agents to execute search warrants on your business and personal properties within the next 48 hours. Victoria's lawyers immediately began discussing plea negotiations and cooperation agreements, but Victoria herself seemed frozen, finally understanding that her decades of criminal behavior had caught up with her in a way that money and influence couldn't fix. As we prepared to leave, Victoria called out one final question. Dorothy, was this ever really about finding your birth parents, or was it always about destroying me? I considered the question seriously. When I drove up to your estate 3 weeks ago, all I wanted was to understand where I came from and why you gave me away. You could have treated me with basic human decency, acknowledged Charles's wishes, and honored the legal documents he left behind. Instead, you chose cruelty and tried to cheat me and Sarah out of our inheritance. Everything that's happening now is the natural consequence of choices you made long before I ever appeared at your door. Victoria nodded slowly, perhaps finally understanding the chain of cause and effect that had led to her downfall. 6 months later, I sat in the courtroom as Victoria Ashworth was sentenced to 15 years in federal prison for financial fraud, tax evasion, and violations of the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act. The Ashworth Foundation had been dissolved, its remaining assets distributed to legitimate charitable organizations under federal oversight. The family business had been restructured under James's leadership, with new policies ensuring employee benefits and ethical business practices. Sarah squeezed my hand as the judge read the sentence. How do you feel, Mom? I thought about the question carefully. Victoria looked smaller in her orange jumpsuit, diminished by the removal of her wealth and power and influence, but I felt no satisfaction in her downfall, no sense of revenge accomplished. I feel like Charles can finally rest, I said quietly. He spent his final years worrying about the crimes he couldn't stop and the daughter he couldn't acknowledge. Now the crimes are being punished, and his daughter finally has the resources to build something better. As we left the courthouse, reporters shouted questions about our plans for the trust fund money, about our relationship with Victoria, about the future of the Ashworth business empire. But I ignored them, focused instead on the conversations Sarah and I had been having for weeks about how to use our unexpected inheritance responsibly. The Henderson Foundation, Sarah said as we drove away from the courthouse, named after the people who actually raised you with love and integrity, will focus on supporting foster children, funding educational opportunities, providing emergency assistance to families in crisis, and employees of the Ashworth companies, I added, making sure their pension funds are fully restored, providing job training for anyone displaced by the corporate restructuring, creating profit-sharing programs so workers benefit from the company's success. 3 years later, I stood in the conference room of what had once been Victoria's private office, now the headquarters of the Henderson Foundation. The walls were covered with thank you letters from scholarship recipients, photos of families who'd received emergency housing assistance, articles about former foster children who'd gone on to college and successful careers. Eleanor Martinez knocked on the door, carrying a folder of documents that needed my signature. She'd become the foundation's executive director after leaving her position with the Ashworth family, bringing 2 decades of administrative experience to our charitable work. Mrs. Williams, these are the quarterly reports for our educational programs. We've provided scholarships to over 800 students this year, including 53 former foster children who are now attending college. I signed the documents with a sense of satisfaction I'd never experienced in my previous life. Charles's trust fund had grown to over $1 billion under careful investment management, generating enough income to fund substantial charitable work while preserving the principal for future generations. Any word from Victoria? Eleanor asked quietly. I shook my head. Victoria had been transferred to a minimum security facility in Connecticut after serving 3 years of her sentence, but she'd never attempted to contact me or Sarah. According to James, who visited her occasionally, she spent her time reading business journals and planning what she would do when she was released in another 8 years. Do you think she's learned anything? Eleanor continued. I considered the question. I think Victoria has learned that actions have consequences, even when you're wealthy enough to delay them for decades. Whether she's learned to value human relationships over financial success, that's harder to say. My phone buzzed with a text from Sarah. Mom, I'm pregnant. You're going to be a grandmother. This baby will have the kind of family support and financial security we could never have imagined. I stared at the message through tears of joy, thinking about Charles's great-grandchild who would grow up knowing they were wanted, loved, and supported by family members who would never abandon them no matter what challenges life presented. That evening, I drove to the small cemetery where Jim and Martha Henderson were buried. Their simple headstones looked modest compared to Charles's elaborate marble monument across town, but these were the people who taught me about love's sacrifice and the importance of treating others with dignity regardless of their circumstances. We did it, I said quietly to their graves. Sarah's having a baby. The foundation is helping thousands of families, and somehow we managed to turn Victoria's cruelty into something positive. Charles finally got justice. Sarah has the security she deserves, and that little baby is going to grow up knowing they're part of a family that chooses love over money every single time. As the sun set over the Sacramento Valley, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink that reminded me of the evening I'd first driven to meet Victoria Ashworth, I felt something I'd never experienced before, complete peace with my place in the world. I was Dorothy Williams, daughter of Charles Ashworth and Victoria Ashworth by biology, but daughter of Jim and Martha Henderson by choice. I was Sarah's mother by adoption and love, soon to be grandmother to a child who would never question whether they were wanted. I was the woman who'd finally held the powerful accountable for their cruelty, who'd turned inherited wealth into tools for justice and support for those who needed help most. The abandoned baby had grown up to build the kind of family she'd always dreamed of, not perfect, not without complications, but founded on the radical idea that love and loyalty were more valuable than money and power. Charles's greatest gift hadn't been the trust fund that made our work possible, but the validation that family bonds are worth fighting for even when it takes 67 years to claim them. Victoria had been wrong about everything that mattered. Love wasn't weakness. It was the foundation that made everything else worthwhile. And sometimes, if you're patient enough and strong enough to demand justice, love really does win in the end.